Before I introduce our speaker, let us begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Savior, we praise you for the gift of this day. We praise you for the gift of our faith, for the privilege to know, love, and serve you. Thank you for the opportunity to gather, to share fellowship, good food and drink, to ponder the mysteries of our faith and the ways that we may grow closer to you. Bless our speaker this evening and open all of our hearts with the gift of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. We ask all of these things through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Mary's seat of wisdom.
Pray for us.
Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, we are happy to welcome back Dr. Gwen Adams, whom we had speak last year. She is a native of Indiana and has her doctorate in theology, in which she focused on parishes and stability in parishes. You know, there's a lot of parish hopping nowadays. And she currently both writes and teaches. And she'll be speaking to us on, as you know, the role of stories and the various characters depicted therein for helping us to grow in virtues. Please welcome Dr. Gwen Adams.
Thank you very much. I want to try to do this talk in 3 pieces and give time for questions in between each of the sections. So the first section, I want to talk about a little bit just how we learn, kind of lay the groundwork. So then in the second section, I can say, so then how are stories helpful for our moral formation, for understanding relationships, for understanding who we should be and how to pursue Christ? And then in the third section, I thought I would give you some examples of stories in particular, maybe that you could start with, some themes I've been looking at in stories, and then sort of get you some recommendations if you're looking for something to read while it's still really cold out. And I also have a couple plays and a couple of movies, which I think are good examples of what I'm talking about. So let's start with the idea of just how we learn so that we can understand how stories are part of that. So I see Dr. Johnson. I feel like whenever I give a talk, I have to talk about Alistair McIntyre. So I want to start with referencing an article by Alistair McIntyre that he wrote in 1987 called How to Be a North American. Alistair McIntyre is a philosopher and a scholar. He is in residence at the University of Notre Dame's Center for Ethics and Culture, and he's been writing for more than 50 years on philosophy and ethics. He's most famous for a book called After Virtue, and he has a rather obscure essay called How to Be a North American, which is about stories. Very interesting read. I highly recommend it. In the essay, he talks about how we don't really have a storytelling culture anymore. In some countries, in some periods of history, storytelling was a huge part of how people spent their time. It's referenced all the time. You can see it from Homer's, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They have the bard. This is a really normal part of their culture, all the way to different kinds of Native American cultures. Storytelling has just been a huge part of life, except not so much right now. And he says, really, we only see storytelling in kind of sort of high culture areas. He said the attics of high culture. And I was thinking, well, you can still see storytelling. There's like the Mock podcast, maybe you've heard of that, and that's kind of a storytelling movement. But I wouldn't call that mainstream culture. It's really interesting and there's some really great stories, but it's still kind of an obscure part of what's going on in our regular daily life. And he asks in the essay, so do we even need stories? Do we really need them? And the essay is kind of, the point of the essay is to answer that question, do we need stories? No, we really do. Come and, okay. So, that was a drive-by interested person. So, we do need stories, says McIntyre, and that's the point of the essay, which I recommend. I don't want to reiterate all the points in there, but I do want to argue with him that a culture without stories suffers a remarkable deprivation because storytelling is crucial for understanding good and evil, and because storytelling itself can be a form of charity. So I want to dive, therefore, into what McIntyre says about how we learn. And I'll borrow a little bit from Flannery O'Connor, too. She's a storyteller and a writer. Anybody in here ever heard of Flannery O'Connor? Oh, good. Yeah, she's a great storyteller. So McIntyre spends a lot of time in various works talking about how we have bodies, talking about the bodily dimensions of our existence. He says we don't merely have, we are our bodies. And that's part of the Catholic faith. But it's also, he's making it from a philosophical point of view. Even though we believe it by faith, and we say in the Creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body, and we have encyclical after encyclical about the unity of the body and the soul, we still, I think, in our modern culture at least, have a lot of trouble actually really thinking of our body as something that we are, instead of something that we just sort of have. It's just kind of with us like a scarf or a hat. I just have it with me. No, we are our bodies. And the fact that we are our bodies impacts every single aspect of our existence. He says there's nothing that we do and no part of human intelligence that's independent of our animality, of being a physical animal creature. So everything that we learn all our life begins with sensory perception. So there's no part where we say, I'm a big adult now, and I don't really need my senses or my imagination or my memory. I'm just a brain now because I've arrived. It says, for every human being, every part of thinking starts in and is accompanied by our senses. So all of our understanding is mediated through our embodied interaction in the world. And that's why it's so important, he says, for how we learn about what is right and wrong, what is good and evil. Everything we understand about that is mediated to us through our experiences, our physical experiences. Everything we understand about good and evil is mediated to us through our particular community and the way that community lives out its life. So he says there's no way to make values compelling without a shared mode of practical life. And there's no way to understand moral concepts apart from examples of them. People can tell you, this is what it looks like to be brave, or this is what charity looks like, or this is what honor looks like, or this is what it looks like to be faithful or loyal. But if you don't really see examples of that in real life, in concrete circumstances, it's going to be a really abstract, kind of feathery, fluffy, cloud-like idea where you say, I sort of get what you're trying to describe, but it doesn't really mean anything to me. I don't understand it because I don't have the kind of mind that's capable of grasping a pure idea completely divorced from sensory experience. McIntyre says you can have rules for human action, for good and evil, but there's no way to make the rules understandable without practice and imitation. So, in my dissertation, I was interested in looking at parishes and stability, specifically the virtue of stability or the virtue of constancy. And I was really interested in the importance of having long-term examples of virtue, not just one time you see a man or a woman do a good thing, but in having examples of seeing someone doing good things, living out their faith, living out love over a long period of time. And that's really important to see not just like one example, but over a long period of time, many examples, because a virtue isn't something you do just one time. McIntyre talks about that, but he's drawing on a huge tradition about that. That's even older than the Catholic faith. That's Aristotle will talk about a habit. A virtue is a habit, which is a manner, a way of being in many different circumstances. So it's not just one-time act of courage, it's courage over a lifetime. So if you're moving around all the time in a parish, you don't get to really have long-term examples. You see one person doing a good thing one time, but then they move away and you don't really know, like, well, they had a good marriage then. Did they still have a good marriage? I don't know. Are they still practicing love towards each other? They were really making sacrifices then, but are they still? I don't know. I don't see them or hang out with them anymore. So you don't get that long-term example. So you can't really have anybody model for you living virtue over the long term. So it's also important to have long-term examples because some virtues can only be modeled over the long term. So you can show braveness, you can show courage in a moment, but it's really hard to show patience in a moment. Because patience, sort of by definition, right, is something that has to take time. You have to keep having days pass where something difficult is happening and you're still being patient about it. Or being faithful to your spouse is something that you have to do over time. You just say, today I'm faithful, but tomorrow I cheat. That's not faithful. That's, you're making a mistake and you get up and you try again, hopefully, right? But that's not the virtue of fidelity. You would have to live out the virtue of fidelity over time. Some virtues can only be demonstrated over time. So that was something I was really interested in exploring about the importance of long-term examples in the parish. But I've also been thinking this past year about what if you don't get examples of virtue, or very many, in your life? What if you don't know very many virtuous people? Or what if you do know some virtuous people, but you've never known one person for a long time? It's getting harder and harder for some people to have their grandparents with them their whole life. Your grandparents maybe live on the other side of the country. So where are these people who are going to model patience or constancy or fidelity over the long haul for you? Maybe you might never meet one. So then I thought, well, then what are we going to do? I mean, if we learn through our senses and through examples, and you don't have any examples in your experience, well, then how are you supposed to learn about virtue? But I thought perhaps this is where stories come in, because stories can give us examples of men and women living in ways that we would like to model. We might never have met a real-life person doing that, but you can meet them in a story. And what's also interesting is in a story, in certain kinds of novels or movies, you can also walk with them through their whole life. And you can see them modeling a virtue through their whole life, but you don't have to live with them for 60 years. You can read about 60 years in a couple of hours. So there's sort of a power to a story that can give you that long-term example in a short space of time and give you some way to understand and wrap your mind around the idea of kindness or mercy or justice or truth-telling. So that's that first part. Does anybody have any questions about how we learn and how stories can be important in that way of learning through our senses? I'll keep going, but if you have questions, just raise your hand, and I'll give another little break in a bit. So, because we learn through examples, we need people in our life, and we also need, in lieu of people, we also need, I think, stories that can help us wrap our minds around these ideas of what it means to live well in the world. So I think that's one of the most powerful formative aspects of storytelling, that it introduces us to experiences we might not get any other way. C.S. Lewis has a great book, Experiment in Criticism, and in the end of the book, he talks about those of us who have been true readers all our life seldom fully realize the enormous extension of our being which we owe to authors. Who says it sort of enlarges us. It gives us experiences we could never have had any other way. And I mean, really, how am I going to meet a warrior like Aragorn in Lord of the Rings? I mean, it's just not, I mean, okay, he's from like a mystical world, okay, but I mean, like in real life, I don't actually know very many soldiers, and I certainly don't know any soldiers like that guy. I don't know any kings. So how am I going to ever experience somebody who's known for many, many years that he has a responsibility to lead his people? I don't know any leaders of people, you know. I'm a modern American. I don't have that kind of aspect in my experience. So when we've been at the Mass readings this week, we've been reading parts of Kings. And all those characters, David and Saul and Samuel, I don't know anybody like that. Yet they have so much humility and courage and nobleness. Has anybody been noticing some of the readings at Mass the past 2 weeks? You got like Saul's trying to kill David. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, Saul's trying to kill David. Saul goes into a cave to take a rest while he's on the hunt for David. It's the cave where David is. David has the opportunity to kill Saul, but he knows, and he really wants to, but he knows that Saul's asleep. He's vulnerable. To sort of go up behind him, behind his back, and kill him like that without a fair fight, that would not be good. Saul's the king, and killing like that is totally a dishonorable, cheating way to treat the whole circumstances. So, real story. I don't know any Davids, not personally, but that story from the Bible gives me a window into a whole world of interactions about how to be heroic and noble and good in a way that I wouldn't get from my neighbors or my brothers or the regular people that I know in my life. They're teaching me other kinds of virtues, but that is an example of how we're able to learn from a story, how it enlarges our experience, as C.S. Lewis says. So, good stories give us embodied experiences. But I want to stress something that was really important to Flannery O'Connor and is important to most artists and writers. They don't want you to read their stories and see it as a sort of fancy homily and say, okay, so the moral of The Lord of the Rings is make sacrifices, the end. Or, let me think of another good example. The moral of, Dr. Johnson, give me a novel that's just too rich to sum up in one sentence. Any novel.
Bleak House.
Oh, Bleak House. Yeah, Bleak House is a really interesting novel, which has a heroine who is an amazing character, but it's an interesting novel because she suffers an illness that physically disfigures her. And I found myself, even though you're like, well, there's more than just physical beauty, right? There's the mind and the soul and the whole person. You don't have to, body image problems coming up when you're reading this book. But I read it and I thought, gosh, it's kind of hard to be excited about her falling in love when she's so physically disfigured by the illness that she got. And I felt horrible. I thought, gosh, I would do this in real life. I would judge her by the affliction that she's born and not see her for who she really is. So you could read that book and be like, there's more than just physical beauty, the end of the story. But it's like hundreds and hundreds of pages, and there's so much more to, is it Edith? Is that her name? Main character? Esther, yeah. There's so much more to Esther, and there's so much more to the other characters than to try to sum it up in a sentence. It's sort of with art and novels and films and paintings and music, they're about the closest thing we have in our experience to actual real human beings. You can't take a person in this room and say, what's the moral of Father Coombs? Sum up Father Coombs in one sentence. Love God. You're like, that's all there is. Or you sum up Dr. Adams. Truth is important. No, I hope there's a lot more than you could just ever say in one sentence. How could you sum up John Paul II? John Paul II in one sentence. Marriage is made by God and beautiful. Okay. No, there's more to John Paul II. You can't sum up people in a moral of a story. And you can't sum up stories in the moral of a story. Flannery O'Connor, when people would say, what does your story mean? She would really come back at them and say, it means the story. The best way to understand or to tell what the story is trying to tell is to tell the story. Not an essay, the story. The story, like the body, incarnates meaning in a way that you can't separate it. You can't really separate the soul from the body. When death does that, it's a horrible fissure that must be healed through the resurrection of the body. It is not supposed to be that way. And you're not a whole person when your body and your soul are separated. Similarly, with art, you can't really separate the sort of ideas and the truths that are coming out from the plot and the characters and the colors and the music and the sounds that are incarnating them. And if you try to do that, you'll never get the full picture. So the beauty of stories is that there's nothing like the story for telling truth, beauty, what it means to be human. You can take a book like Bleak House, and there are a billion essays on it, and dissertations, and theses, and articles, and thousands of pages trying to understand and explain what's happening in this book. And you could keep going. You could go on and on, but you'll never get something that's equal to Bleak House, because Bleak House is by itself telling something that you can't just spin out into a moral of a story. So what am I trying to say here? There's something in stories, like with people, that teaches us about how to be human more powerfully than just a simple sentence about how to be human. You should love the truth. You should not tell lies. Okay, but that is not as rich an understanding of the truth as you're going to get from reading a story about truth lived out or meeting a person who loves the truth. If you meet a person who loves the truth, you're going to understand truth in a way you've never understood before. And this makes sense because ultimately truth isn't sentences. Truth is a person. Christ is a person. Christ is the truth. So it makes sense that ultimately you couldn't really hammer it out in a lot of essay-like forms, the things that we believe in. So that's kind of a roundabout way of arguing why I think it's important to interact with good people, holy people, and to interact with good literature, because there's understanding about life and people that you're going to get from them in a much richer way than you could ever get by just reading the Catechism alone. The Catechism is not going to teach you about Christ, love, holiness, in the way that being near a saint or reading about a saint will, or reading about a great woman or man in a piece of literature. So that's kind of the ideas part of the talk. Does anybody have any questions? I want to also give you some ideas of things to read and show what I'm talking about in some particular novels. Does anybody have any questions about this part?
Comment. Aristotle names phronesis as a virtue that you can only acquire by being around other people who have it, making good decisions in different circumstances, and while on the one hand there'd be no substitute for good company, but what you're alluding to, it sounds like, is that reading about virtuous people is a way of abiding in their company. In a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Allowing their virtues to rub off on you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. From Mises, or Practical Judgment, he has a very pithy line. I think it's in After Virtue, says, there are rules, but there are no rules for how to apply the rules. So we know that, okay, you should practice honesty, but then you get into some of these sticky situations, and there's even stickier ones, all kinds of bioethical issues. Think, well, what am I supposed to do now? And in these particular circumstances, and there's not really, in so many ways, any kind of code that you can refer to. That's when we look to somebody who really does know how to practice virtue for the answer. How are you supposed to live in a concentration camp when they are crushing the life out of you and taking away every opportunity for any human interaction? But then you read a story like Maximilian Kolbe and you think, oh, well, wow, okay, well, there's one way that someone didn't let the camp take away his will and his ability to care for other human beings. He could have just kept silent. We all could. But he actually spoke out and said, why don't you take me? So that's, there's no way to prepare for how you're supposed to live in a concentration camp. You know that you shouldn't actually actively kill the other camp members. That would be murder. We know that. But then after that, what do you do? That's what somebody like Maximilian Kolbe, a real story, can teach us, this sort of practical application of what's, after you follow the rule about murder, okay, what's the next way to practice love on a heroic level? Anybody else have any thoughts or questions about stories?
I just have a comment too. This has been like on my mind lately, is living extraordinary in the ordinary things. So it doesn't even, like, you don't even have to be put in this awful like situation like being in a concentration camp. But living on a day-to-day basis is very difficult too in our world, and so sometimes you can be really discouraged, and like the only things that I know work for me to like have courage to keep living a holy lifestyle is by surrounding myself by friends and seeing how they live, or reading the lives of the saints, or reading scripture, because God can speak to you through scripture too. So that's just been on my mind, is living extraordinary in the ordinary things. Because it's hard. But
yeah, and there's so much that you can learn and understand through your own personal prayer, and so I always recommend that as the bedrock. But then we're all just limited, right? And our imaginations are limited. We only have our own experience to go off of. So if you need new insights, and we all do, and you need new experiences to help you understand, well, how are you navigating all the stresses of this course that we're taking? Or how are you dealing with that very difficult roommate or professor, or not, professors are amazing, right? So the roommates are all good too. So, but how are you doing it? Other people widen our experience. How are you dealing with problems that come up in dating, or problems that come up with non-dating, or whatever? Other people's experiences enrich you. And then the saint stories, they enrich you. They open your options. They enlarge. I love that line of C.S. Lewis's. They broaden their horizon. So here's some stories I thought would be good starters if you're looking for something to read. I would recommend, if you want, I'm probably going to put this talk up, or a link to this talk. Is that going to be on? Oh, yeah, that'd be fine. So I'm going to mention my blog. I've been blogging for 10 years on Christian culture. So it's full of great things to read, good films to watch, how to celebrate a feast or give a party for a liturgical feast, how to start telling stories, good, all kinds of ways to build Christian culture with your friends and with your family. So I'm going to name a couple of books and talk about some examples, but I have tons of recommendations on there if you want. And you can come up to me afterwards, or we can do this in Q&A too if you want some other examples. So one kind of book that I have been looking for, my blog address, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm so easy to find. No, my blog is called christianintegration.blogspot.com. Integration as in integrating everything, integrating Christian life into our lives. christianintegration.blogspot.com. So, I have been looking for a certain kind of book to help me understand this aspect of Christian life. And I started just on a whim, but then I got really curious. So I was looking for not just examples of a particular virtue, but the whole package of in particular roles, specifically examples of good fathers. Next I'll do good mothers in literature. So that means a whole host of virtues and ways of interacting with your children that that you're looking for in a good father. So who are good literary fathers? That was my question. I thought this would be really interesting. Maybe I could sort of put together a whole series and write a paper on it or give a talk on it. Whoa, very difficult to find any literature with good fathers in it. I just kept coming book after book of it, and then this father's so bad, and so is this father, and this father is really bad, and this is how this father ruined his kids' lives. And I thought, whoa, is it so difficult to find a good father in literature? Well, so far for me, it has been. I'd love to hear if anybody in here has recommendations of novels or films with a great father in them. It already brings up the question of, well, how do you define what a great father is? Well, that's partly why I want the literary example, because you could I could make a little list of sort of what I'm looking for, but there's nothing like reading about a good father. When you read about a good father, you say, that's it, okay, I found it, because incarnated in the real example is much better than trying to make a list of qualities that you're looking for. So, here is a novel I found, which is actually a children's novel, and I just finished rereading it. The last time I read it, I was a kid, and I just reread it as an adult now. And I thought the father in it was astounding and has a lot to teach us about fatherhood. And I think it's important for all of us for a couple of reasons. Our image of God the Father is mediated to us through our experiences, through people. And people are fallen. People all have flaws and failings. And so our dads and other dads that we meet and other sort of fatherly figures, good teachers and priests and kind older brothers, all these people who are mediating the idea of what it means to be a good father, or even sort of women we've met in our life who are good leaders or particularly helpful mentors, this sort of package of whatever we're looking for, they all make mistakes. And so all of them are going to fail us in some way to teach us exactly what God the Father is like. So the more examples you can get of fathers and fatherly figures in your real life and in literature, the better idea you're going to have of what God the Father is really like. If you stay limited to a handful of the father examples who are pretty bad fathers, you are not likely to have a very good idea of what God the Father is like, because you're just not going to have any kind of sensory, imaginative, embodied experience of that. You'll hear it at church, God the Father is good and loving, and you may believe it by faith, but what that really looks like will be probably really difficult for you, and we all have to figure that out in our prayer to grow in the Christian life. So if you find an example of a good father, that's going to give you a window into what is God really like? How does he really love me? It's also important for us not just to know God the Father, but also to be a good father. And this impacts all of us. Some of us in here are going to be fathers, and others of us are going to know fathers, or be married to fathers, or be parents of fathers, or friends of fathers. And so we all have a stake in helping them figure out what does that look like, and how do I do it well? How do I care for my children, and care for young people, and care for the vulnerable? So here's this book. It's just, maybe you've heard of it before, Laura Ingalls Wilder's Farmer Boy. How many in here have ever heard of that book? Yeah, I was not expecting to have this sort of life-changing revelation, but I did. So, Farmer Boy, his dad is an extremely amazing dad. Here's 3 things that I picked up from that book which taught me about God the Father and what it means to be a father. So first of all, they have tons of interaction. I was amazed by how much time Al Manzo, the main character, Al Manzo's father and he spend time together. They go fishing together, and they don't just go fishing, they talk all the way through the fishing. I thought, so that's interesting. I was trying to imagine it. It's not just sort of like strong dad silently sitting there and son sort of like sitting next to him. They are chatting the whole time. So the dad is listening to the son, and they're having this conversation back and forth. They talk while they're making maple syrup. They talk when they go to the fair, and in that chapter you actually get the dialogue is recorded, so you see what they're talking about. And there's a little reaction. Almanzo's talking horses with his father. They're looking at all the horses that are on show, and there's prizes being given. And they're talking about horses, and Almanzo, it just says he felt really grown up and important to be talking about horses with his father. And I thought, that is such a small thing, but it's so important in our relationship with God the Father. He wants us to talk with him sort of face to face about important things, not I'm God up here and you're down there, you're just a small person that I made. It's really amazing how Almanzo's father sort of brings him into his own world, and they talk almost like peers. They work together, they make shingles together. There's a lot of interaction, and there's a lot of respect that the father has for that young 9-year-old boy who's the main character. And all that interaction leads to the second point in how this father models what it means to be a good father, is that he really understands Almanzo. Chapter after chapter, Laura Ingalls Wilder sets it up really nice. So in chapter 2, Almanzo sees a friend of his who has a store-bought cap, which is really nice, it's really cool, and he knows they'll never be able to afford that. And the boy who's got the cap is like, I bet your dad won't buy you one of those. And Almanzo's like awkward and ashamed and goes home. And so all these chapters pass. It's like 11 chapters later, and it's Christmas, and it's 3:30 in the morning, and Almanzo gets up and he runs down and opens his stocking way early, like an hour and a half early. And there's the store-bought cap in it. So like almost a year later, and he had no idea how they knew that he wanted that cap. But they did. There's so much knowledge that they have of his needs. He had never asked for the cap, but his needs aren't known. And he just starts screaming and screaming. It's just so exciting to him. There's another example in a different chapter. I think it's a present, but it might just be a surprise, where his father says, would you like to make a bobsled? And the son's like, could I maybe then help you haul wood? This is a very like grown-up thing that he wants to help with. And the dad's like, what else would you need a bobsled for? And so the kid's like, oh my gosh, how did he read my mind? It's amazing. So there's a beautiful understanding that the father has from the son. And I gotta think that although Almanzo thinks like, I never actually specifically said it out loud, all that knowledge comes from all the interaction. And then thirdly, he is a good father because he is mentoring Almanzo and encouraging him to grow. There were a lot of things in this novel, Farmer Boy, that reminded me of John Paul II's encyclical Laborans Exertions, which is about work and the dignity of work. And John Paul II talks about how God designed work. It's supposed to unite us to other people, and it's supposed to be a way that we can model God, the maker of heaven and earth. So work, when it's working, is supposed to be something that helps us be creative and mature and exercise freedom and intelligence and agency. So if you are being treated like a cog in a wheel and being encouraged to feel like and act like a cog in a wheel, that's not what work's supposed to look like. You're supposed to have a role in your work. So the father of Almanzo is constantly giving him opportunities to grow in maturity and responsibility with the work. And it's amazing just how much he does this, and even at possible cost to himself. So there's one example. You see them, they make hay, very labor intensive. And they're, after spending all day making hay and so tired, there's one little throwaway line about the first bale of hay that they make with the new machine. So apparently it was harder before they got the machine. So the first bale of hay they make, I just thought that'd just kill me. So they make it. It's 250 pounds. And the dad just picks it up and he throws it over there. I was like, what? 250? I worked on a farm and they were 60 pounds. I was like, oh, kill me now. You know, and I'm just trying to imagine that kind of work. So they make all the hay. And then that night they're at dinner, and Almanzo has been recently learning to multiply. And he sits at the table and he's thinking so hard, he's eating dinner, he suddenly interrupts everybody, goes, at $2 a bale, and there's 60 bales, that's going to be, and everybody just looks at him, and he's like, oh, sorry. And the dad's like, well, I guess you've been studying your multiplication, that's good. And he said, would you like to come with me and sell the hay? And he doesn't just bring Almanzo to watch him sell the hay. He is silent the whole time, and he lets Almanzo, 10 years old, sell all that hay. I was thinking, would I put a child in charge of all those hours of work? And that's money we're talking about. I just don't think I would risk. I don't know if I would let somebody who was under 30. You know, it was just like, I just realized, whoa, I'm a real snob about who impacts me with my work or my money or whatever. And here's Almanzo's father letting the 10-year-old run the entire transaction. So Almanzo does. He goes up to the grown-up man who's going to buy the hay, and he haggles with him, and he's like, will you take $2.25 a bale? And the man's like, no, I mean, $1.75, really. And Almanzo says, I don't know, this is good hay. And the man's like, well, how about $2? And Almanzo says, are you offering $2? This kid's awesome. And the man's like, well, I guess so. And Almanzo says, done. And the man's like, whoa. The man's like, oh my gosh, I just promised to sell it for more than I want to sell it for. And then he asks Almanzo, so wait, why did you say $2.25? And Almanzo says, well, I knew if I said 2 that you would sell it at $1.75. So I said $2.25, so we could get it for 2. And the man's like, your son is very smart, Mr. Wilder. And I just thought, that's so cool. Almanzo does grow up to be a farmer like his father, and a very successful farmer. And it's because his father respects him and is willing to take risks like that. So there's one more story from Farmer Boy, which is just so exciting and along the same lines as this. With the father sort of teaching Almanzo the value of work and to really grow in his creativity and responsibility. So they go to the fair, and there's all these fun things you could spend your money on. And there's a pink lemonade stand. And so the same boy with the store-bought cap who was like teasing Almanzo in another chapter, he's like, hey Almanzo, I got 5 cents and I spent it on pink lemonade. And he's being like really annoying. Almanzo doesn't have an allowance. He doesn't have 5 cents to spend it on lemonade. The kid like drinks all the lemonade in front of Almanzo, and he's like, I bet your dad wouldn't give you 5 cents. And then all these boys crowd around, so it's super awkward. Almanzo's like, I've never asked my father for money in my entire life. What would he say? And they're like, we dare you, he's not going to give it to you, go ask him for 5 cents. So Almanzo goes, he feels like he wants to throw up. He goes up to his father's talking to a friend. He waits, and then they're like, well, and he asks for the 5 cents. And at first Almanzo's father thought that he wanted the 5 cents to treat the other boy. So he thought like the boy had bought Almanzo lemonade, so Almanzo wants to buy him lemonade. And he said, is that what you want the 5 cents for? And Almanzo wants so badly to save face that he lies. And then he suddenly feels really sick, and he realizes he's lying to his father about, and so he squirms. He says, no. And so the father is like, so what do you want the money for? And he said, lemonade. And so the father waits for a second, and then the friend of the father says, he's too small to understand, Wilder. You can't explain these kinds of things to him. And it's a cool moment, because the father sort of looks proud of Almanzo and is sort of like, I'm going to show you how great my son is. And that's what God the Father's like with us. I'm going to show you how great he is. And he says to Almanzo, he holds out $50, 50 cents. That doesn't, none of this sounds like a lot of money to us, but multiply it by 10 or 20. So he holds this up and says, how much, and he asks an example, like how many hours does it take us to plant potatoes? And how many potatoes do we get? And then how do we hoe them, and we manure them, and then we dig them out, and then we pick them over, and we cut out the bad ones, and then we take them to town, and how long does it take us to take them to town, and how much do we get for them? So at the end of all that, Almanzo's sort of doing math in his head. He says, how many potatoes and how many hours does this represent? And Almanzo sort of spits out the answer and realizes all the hours and all the work that it takes to get $50. And the father says, I'm going to give you this, and it'll be your money, and you can spend it as you want. You can go and get all the pink lemonade you could possibly drink. Or you could go and buy a small pig who will raise other pigs, and you could sell each of those pigs, a litter of 10 pigs, sell each of those pigs for $5. So it's sort of like you can get a whole bunch of pink lemonade, drink it up, or you could take it, and by working at it, you could make $50. The choice is yours. He's like 10, right? And so he takes, like, he's never seen so much money in his life, or had it. He takes the money back to the boys, and they're like, did your dad give you a nickel? And he says, no. And they're like, Dad, I knew he wouldn't give you a nickel. And they're all like throwing their hats and like cheering and stuff like that. And he goes, he gave me $50. And everyone's like, well, it'd be like if you held like a $100 bill out to a whole bunch of 10-year-old boys and be like, what? And they all have to see it. And they're like, what are you going to do with it? And he says, I'm going to go buy me a little pig. And he like walks off with it. And it's just like, what a great dad. Like in every way, he is mentoring and listening to and caring for. He buys gifts that show knowledge of Almanzo. He gives him challenges that help him grow. So you got all these kinds of virtues: courage, charity, sympathy, attention, honesty, mentoring, all in one package. I thought that was really an amazing example. And there's a little bit of time for me to give some other examples, unless anybody has any questions.
What about Atticus Finch from Japan?
Oh, that's a great one. I would bring him up, but I haven't read it in like 15 years. But he is a great one. To Kill a Mockingbird, I highly recommend that book. Great father. And there's a wonderful, I do remember a wonderful moment in it where the kids are just like, our dad's so lame. And then they realize that he is actually incredibly brave. It's a very exciting moment when they were like, whoa, that's our dad. Oh, that's cool. Yeah. So.
I guess like backtracking a little bit. In the second point that you made, you talk about like surrounding yourself with virtuous people and those stories. But how do you kind of hold in tension our calls to Christian disciples when you go out into margins and get kind of messy? So kind of like holding that temptation of like really easy to stay in this bubble where everyone is, super virtuous and whatnot. But like how do you kind of also take that and go out into the message?
Oh, it's a great question. I think really that you want to become very aware of yourself and bring that to prayer and to the advice of other people and take it a day at a time. Because I think some days you could spend most of the day being that missionary person where you are modeling to others and just showing them charity and being with them. But you want to also watch yourself, as because you cannot give what you do not have. That's many saints have said that. Thomas Aquinas says that. So you want to keep a watch on, are you getting drained? Are you getting exhausted? Are you feeling like you're doing all the loving and all the listening, and who's loving you and who's listening to you? And that is a time where you need to sort of be aware of what you're capable of. God doesn't ask us to be more missionary or more than we're capable of. So we want to do both. I wouldn't say that it would be good for anybody to say, like, I'm going to take the entire year and I'm just going to bone up on my friendships and on my reading. And then when that's completely done, then I will go out and be a missionary for a year. I think you really want to do it, half and half during the day, every other. I think it really depends on where you're at and what the needs of the particular people that you're going out to are. Some of them don't need so much and they won't maybe drain you so much. And sometimes you think you're going to listen to them and they end up listening to you, and you thought you're going to the fringes and they just taught you all this stuff. So, okay, you thought you're going to be drained and you weren't. You're filled. So maybe I don't need to spend so much time tomorrow filling up because I'm actually doing all right. Does that make sense? I would really be responsive to your needs, and that both calls to have the models and the support and to be a missionary. Awesome question, thank you. Anybody else?
What advice might you have for authors?
Yeah, I wanted to just name some other works to get you started. So, let me give you a play. I would say King Lear by Shakespeare. If you are up to I think it's awesome. You could watch it or read it. I think reading it is better for your imagination because it really depends on how the actor does this. The character of Kent is really amazing for looking at what does loyalty look like, especially if you're loyal to a person who has made mistakes. I mean, personally, I want to be loyal to people who are awesome. And if they're if they made mistakes, it's not as exciting. But Kent is loyal to Lear when Lear has done some things that are not that good, and when being loyal means suffering. So King Lear is very interesting. I'd also say 3 movies. Captain America is really interesting for a hero who doesn't also have to have a lot of dark sides. There's so many heroes out there who they use really bad language, or they shoot they'll shoot people randomly. Or Captain America actually seems to do a good job of being really virtuous, but also admirable and brave and heroic. I think he's really interesting, especially in the one, the Civil War, where it's got I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it has a huge tension between revenge and justice. So friends are pitted against friends over issues that are really difficult. That's a very beautiful film to watch. Or The Giver, both the book and the film. Lois Lowry, that's a really interesting book about telling the truth and protecting the vulnerable, even if it means to suffer. And here's some books. Great, okay. Here's some books. I would look for Ratty in Kenneth Graham's Wind in the Willows. Great friend, loyal friend, funny friend. Children's book, very good book. I would also take a look maybe at Jane Austen's Persuasion. Have you ever dated somebody and then broken up and not seen them and then walk in the room a couple years later and there they are and that feels really awkward? Anybody maybe ever? You don't have to raise your hand, but that Anne Elliot gets in that position, so you know how difficult that is. And then Anne Elliot is also a person who everybody goes to her with their problems to gossip about other people. And maybe you've ever been in that position before, and you're like, why is everybody talking to me about so-and-so? I'd like so much drama. And Anne Elliot is an amazing character for how she doesn't give in to gossip, and she doesn't betray anybody, and she doesn't revel in the drama either. She's an amazing example of trustworthiness and discretion. And then the difficult romantic aspect of it is it's a really interesting novel. Also, if you're looking for another father figure, and I'll give you a great sort of mother-aunt figure, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, very gritty, dark, post-apocalyptic novel, but a very amazing father in there who endures incredible suffering to take care of his son. It's a great novel, and it's very long, but talk about getting a long-term embodied example. Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, I think it starts with "I am born," so we're starting at the beginning. He, as a child, gets into a very abusive situation, neglect. It's horrible, and you feel like the doom and the hopelessness with him. And then out of the blue, this really stiff, starchy old lady, Aunt Betsy Trotwood. She's like very scary and formidable, but she comes in and she says, "No, you don't," and she takes David Copperfield out of that horrible mess into a completely different life and gets him started on his feet. And she's like just an interesting character, someone who's got a little rough around the edge. That's not the right word. She's a little bit scary because she seems so strict, but she is willing to go into the situation and take David out of there. And she could have just said, "He's not my kid, and I don't really have what it takes to adopt someone and bring somebody into my home." But she doesn't stop there. She goes and she takes David and she cares for him. Love Aunt Betsy Trotwood. And then the last example I had was Gawain. If you get Roger Lancelyn Green's version of King Arthur, you should look for the story in there of Gawain and Lady Radnor. Through a lot of weird circumstances, Gawain ends up marrying Lady Radnor, and she's this hideous, monstrous hag. Just horrible looking. And so they've had the wedding, and the feast is over, and now they're in their sort of honeymoon suite, and Gawain is like, "Well, it's really hard being married to someone who's so hideous." And it turns out Lady Ragnar is under a curse, and she says, "So half of the day I'm beautiful and gorgeous," and he gets a glimpse of what she looks like when she's beautiful and gorgeous, "and half the day I look like this. So it's up to you to choose which half of the day you want." And so it's medieval. It's a little bit it's not bawdy, but they go right to the really crux of the matter. And Gawain's thinking, "Oh gosh, so ugly by night, or beautiful by day, or ugly by day but beautiful by night. Well, that would be a huge benefit to me." And he finally says to her, it doesn't take him very long at all. It takes a minute. He says, "I guess I would wish that you would be beautiful by day and ugly by night, because I think you will suffer more if you are ugly by day, because that's when you're going to see everybody, and most people are going to see you, and I'm the only one who will see you when you're beautiful by night." It's really cool because she goes, "Oh my gosh, you just broke the entire curse. Now I'm beautiful all the time, and it's really completely, So that's the curse. Would there be a man who could actually make that kind of sacrifice and be like, "You don't need to be beautiful for me. You can, what you need." So that breaks the curse, and all the lead up to Gawain, and he has other adventures later, but I just really like Gawain. Because he never acts like, "This is so easy for me. Of course I will make the heroic thing." You can feel the pain with him, but then he does the right thing, and that yields. They actually have an amazing happy marriage, so as it says, happily ever after. So Gawain's a great character too. So those are some examples to start with, and I have lots more on my blog, christianintegration.blogspot.com. And do we have time for questions, or are we kind of
Sure.
Any questions before we wrap up? Mm-hmm.
Talk a lot about consuming literature, consuming stories. What about using writing as a sandbox or trying out how someone might react or what you think might happen in a situation?
Or
Oh, That's very interesting. I would really, well, with this idea with the father stories, I would really love it if somebody, instead of there's a lot of literature on bad fathers. It's really easy to create one. If somebody would try to write, not just to say, I want a good moral example, but try to write a character that would help you wrap your mind around, well, what should it look like? What should it be like? I would love to sponsor some kind of grant for like a short story or a novel contest where you could say, write me a character that you would love to spend time with, who is believable, not just like, well, he's just so holy and fake, but somebody who really you could admire and want to be like. So does that kind of answer your question? I think the stories that we need have not all been written yet. So I think if people keep experimenting and trying to write stories and tell stories, I think that adds hugely to the conversation and to trying to figure out, so what should it look like? Did that answer your, okay, yeah, okay. Good?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for an excellent both description of the rationale behind narrative and its edifying effect on us, hopefully, as well as the examples. Very excellent. A couple other, one primary other recommendation would be Father Elijah by Michael O'Brien. An excellent book with I think a believable main protagonist. Of course, and then just when you mentioned authentic examples of virtue and the fact that truth can be stranger than fiction, and so really the lives of the saints, given when you read some of those stories, as I know everyone in here has experienced at some point, you couldn't make this stuff up. It would be absurd if it were proposed as a fictional feat of the imagination, but in fact they happened, and they're magnificent. But even more primarily, when you mention our need for concrete, embodied illustrations of goodness, it explains perfectly why God became incarnate, really. Why God, instead of merely expatiating on abstract truths, has throughout Israel's history told us stories of very imperfect characters, and then finally come down himself actually to embody and express and lead the way in holiness himself. So a marvelous window, Dr. Adams, into better understanding the role of our Savior. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you not next month, but actually sooner than that. We'll do March's segment the last week of this month, so it'll be February 27th. Look forward to seeing you then, if not sooner. Thank you and have a wonderful night.